You walk into a store. You see a power drill for $12, a complete set of hand tools for $8, a microwave for $35. You buy it. You do not ask yourself the obvious question, how is this possible? The shipping container holding these products traveled 7,500 miles across the Pacific Ocean. The steel in the drill was mined, smelted, and forged. The plastic was extracted from petroleum, refined, and injection molded. Workers assembled dozens of components. Quality inspectors checked each unit. Packaging designers created boxes. Warehouse workers loaded pallets. Truckers moved inventory to ports. Cranes lifted containers onto ships, burning thousands of gallons of fuel per hour. Customs agents processed paperwork on both ends. American truckers delivered the goods to regional distribution centers. Store employees stocked the shelves. And after all of this, the drill costs $12. The math does not work. You know this instinctively. A similar drill manufactured in Ohio or Michigan or Pennsylvania would cost $60. Minimum. The price gap is not 10% or 20%, it is 400%. And this gap exists across thousands of product categories, from Christmas ornaments to industrial machinery, from children's toys to pharmaceutical ingredients. People assume Chinese products are cheap because Chinese workers earn less. Labor arbitrage. Simple economics. Labor arbitrage explains apportion. It does not explain a 400% price differential. It does not explain why Vietnamese workers who earn similar wages produce goods costing significantly more. It does not explain why Mexican workers, geographically closer to American markets with lower shipping costs, lose contracts to Chinese factories 7,000 miles away. The labor theory is the cover story. The real explanation lives in government archives, WTO dispute records, Treasury Department reports, and academic databases containing decades of economic research. The China price is not an accident of geography or culture. It is not the natural result of a billion people entering the global labor force. The China price is an engineered system constructed deliberately over 40 years through 4 interlocking mechanisms: currency manipulation, state subsidization, labor cost suppression, and environmental cost externalization. These mechanisms created a pricing floor no other nation on earth could match, not because they lacked workers, not because they lacked factories, but because they operated under constraints the Chinese system eliminated. This was economic leverage applied at the structural level. The Chinese state identified bottlenecks in global manufacturing. They engineered incentive systems rewarding export volume over domestic consumption. They made Chinese factories untouchable on price by shifting costs invisible to the buyer onto Chinese citizens, Chinese water tables, Chinese air quality, and American manufacturing workers who watched their plants close in slow motion. The result was a 40-year extraction of industrial capacity from developed economies. The infrastructure of production migrated east. The pressure points of global supply chains concentrated in Chinese ports. The gatekeepers of critical material flows became Chinese state enterprises. This was not competition. This was conquest. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. The $12 drill in your garage connects to 2.4 million American manufacturing jobs eliminated between 1999 and 2011. It connects to the pharmaceutical supply chain vulnerability exposed when COVID-19 hit, and 90% of antibiotic production sat in Chinese facilities. It connects to the electric vehicle you're considering purchasing, where Chinese models undercut American and European alternatives by 20 to 40%, and your government now debates tariffs exceeding 100%. The choices you face at checkout counters, car dealerships, and solar panel installers are not free market outcomes. They are the downstream effects of a deliberate strategy documented in Chinese government planning documents, exposed in WTO tribunal rulings, and quantified by economists at MIT, Harvard, and the Federal Reserve. You are living inside the consequences of the China price. Understanding how it was constructed is the first step toward understanding the economic pressures shaping your future. On July 21, 2005, the People's Bank of China announced a policy shift. The yuan, pegged to the dollar at 8.28 since 1994, would now float against a basket of currencies. Western economists celebrated. The currency manipulation problem, they declared, was solving itself. They were wrong. The yuan appreciated. Slowly. Too slowly. Between 2005 and 2008, the currency moved from 8.28 to 6.83 against the dollar, an 18% adjustment spread across 3 years. During the same period, the U.S. Treasury Department issued biannual reports documenting Chinese intervention in currency markets exceeding $500 billion annually. China was buying dollars and selling yuan at a pace never before recorded in monetary history. The mechanism was simple in design and devastating in effect. When a Chinese factory sold a container of goods to an American retailer, the payment arrived in dollars. Under normal market conditions, the factory would exchange those dollars for yuan, increasing demand for yuan and pushing its value upward. A more expensive yuan would make Chinese exports more expensive. Market forces would naturally reduce the trade imbalance. China broke this feedback loop. The People's Bank of China absorbed the incoming dollars, printing yuan to pay the factories. The dollars accumulated in foreign exchange reserves. By 2014, China held $4 trillion in reserves, the largest stockpile in human history. This was not defensive monetary policy. This was export subsidy through currency manipulation. Congressional Research Service analysts calculated the effect of subsidy. Between 2003 and 2014, the yuan was undervalued by 15 to 40%, depending on the methodology used. A 15% undervaluation meant every Chinese product arrived at American ports with a built-in 15% price advantage. A 40% undervaluation meant American manufacturers started every competition at a 40% deficit. You could not overcome this deficit with better management. You could not overcome it with superior technology. You could not overcome it with harder working employees. The deficit existed before any business decisions were made. It was baked into the exchange rate by government policy. The Treasury Department documented this reality in report after report. Yet for 25 years, no administration designated China a currency manipulator. The designation carried no automatic penalties, but it would have forced formal negotiations and public acknowledgement of the strategy. The designation finally came in August 2019. By then, 3 decades of currency-enabled pricing advantage had already restructured global manufacturing. The delay illustrates the asymmetry of the economic warfare. American consumers benefited from lower prices at Walmart and Target. American corporations benefited from lower input costs for manufacturing. American importers benefited from fatter margins. These groups formed a powerful constituency against confrontation. American manufacturing workers bore the concentrated costs, while benefits dispersed across 330 million consumers. The political economy made sustained pressure difficult. Each administration found reasons to delay action. The next round of climate negotiations required Chinese cooperation. North Korean nuclear talks needed Chinese participation. The Treasury report could wait another 6 months. 6 months became 6 years. 6 years became 16. The currency weapon operated in plain sight while policymakers constructed justifications for inaction. The academic research quantified the damage. David Otter of MIT led a team examining commuting zones across the United States, measuring the impact of Chinese import competition on local labor markets. Their findings, published in the American Economic Review in 2013, established the term China shock in economic literature. Between 1999 and 2011, Chinese import competition directly caused the elimination of 2.4 million American manufacturing jobs. The job losses concentrated geographically. Communities dependent on furniture manufacturing, textile production, electrical equipment, and metal fabrication absorbed disproportionate damage. Counties in North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan lost 15 to 25% of their manufacturing employment in a single decade. The currency undervaluation powered this import surge. A refrigerator assembled in Qingdao with a true production cost of $400 entered the American market at an effective price of $320 or $240, depending on the yuan's suppression level. The domestic producer in Louisville, paying market wages, market electricity rates, and market compliance costs, could not match the price. The Louisville plant closed. The Qingdao plant expanded. The Treasury Department issued another report noting progress in currency flexibility. Currency manipulation formed one pillar. State subsidies formed another. On December 11, 2001, China acceded to the World Trade Organization after 15 years of negotiations. The accession protocol contained commitments on transparency, subsidy notification, and market access. Within 5 years, WTO dispute records would document systematic violations of these commitments on a scale unprecedented in the organization's history. 54 formal disputes have been filed against China since 2001, more than against any other WTO member during an equivalent period. The dispute records read like a catalog of industrial policy mechanisms. Case DS-394 challenged grants and loans to Chinese producers of wind power equipment. Case DS-395 targeted automobile part tariffs, designed to force foreign manufacturers into technology transfer arrangements. Case DS-399 documented export restrictions on rare earth minerals, creating artificial scarcity for foreign manufacturers, while Chinese producers received preferential access. Case DS-427 exposed subsidies to the Chinese solar panel industry, totaling billions of dollars, enabling manufacturers to sell panels below production cost and drive American and European competitors into bankruptcy. The WTO's own reporting mechanism confirmed the scope of state support. China's subsidy notification reports documented over 93 programs providing more than $500 billion to export industries. And this figure, compiled from China's own admissions, captured only a fraction of the actual support. The real subsidy architecture operated through mechanisms deliberately obscured from WTO scrutiny. State-owned banks provided loans to exporters at interest rates below the cost of funds. The differential between market rates and subsidized rates represented an invisible transfer payment. Companies receiving loans at 3%, while market rates sat at 7%, received an annual subsidy equal to 4% of their borrowed capital. Scale this across hundreds of billions in industrial lending, and the subsidy value reached tens of billions annually. Land grants functioned similarly. Local governments provided factory sites at prices below market value or at no cost. The documented cost of industrial land in Shenzhen or Dongguan should have rivaled prices in comparable Asian industrial zones. Instead, Chinese manufacturers received long-term leases at valuations disconnected from market realities. The difference represented another invisible subsidy. Energy pricing completed the triangle. Chinese electricity rates for industrial users operated below generation costs during the critical 2000 to 2015 growth period. Coal-fired power plants, often running at a loss, supplied cheap electricity to export factories. The losses were absorbed by state-owned grid companies, recapitalized periodically by government transfers. The American competitor in Ohio paid market rates for electricity. The Chinese competitor in Guangdong paid subsidized rates. The price differential appeared in the final product cost. These subsidies violated WTO rules, but enforcement operated on timelines measured in years, not months. A successful WTO complaint required filing, preliminary hearings, panel formation, evidence presentation, initial ruling, appeal, final ruling, and compliance monitoring. The fastest cases concluded in 3 years, complex cases stretched to 7 or 8. During these years, the subsidized production continued. Chinese solar panels flooded European markets while the DS-427 case wound through Geneva. By the time the WTO ruled in 2011, German and American solar manufacturers had already declared bankruptcy. The ruling came too late. The industry had moved. Chinese planners understood this temporal asymmetry. Speed mattered. The 5-year plan cycle aligned perfectly with WTO enforcement timelines. Subsidize an industry heavily during one plan cycle. Achieve global market dominance. If a WTO case materializes, it will conclude as the next plan cycle begins. Restructure the subsidies to address the specific ruling while maintaining effective support through alternative mechanisms. The 5-year plans documented this strategic patience in official language. The 7th 5-year plan, covering 1986 to 1990, explicitly targeted export-led growth as a national priority. The 10th 5-year plan, 2001 to 2005, coinciding with WTO accession, outlined state support for strategic industries including electronics, machinery, and textiles. The 13th 5-year plan, 2016 to 2020, introduced Made in China 2025, a comprehensive strategy for achieving global dominance in 10 advanced manufacturing sectors. Made in China 2025 became briefly notorious in Western media before Chinese officials reduced public discussion of the program. The document itself remained accessible in archived versions and academic analyses. Its contents revealed the continuity of strategic intent across 4 decades. The plan set explicit market share targets: 70% domestic content for core components in electric vehicles by 2025, 40% global market share in solar cells, 70% self-sufficiency in high-end semiconductors. These were not market projections. They were state objectives, backed by subsidy infrastructure designed to achieve them. The academic term arrived in 2013. The reality arrived years earlier. Hickory, North Carolina built its economy on furniture. Generations of families worked in the mills and factories producing chairs, tables, and bedroom sets. The industry employed 40,000 workers across Catawba County and surrounding areas in 2000. Hickory furniture meant quality. Customers paid premium prices for the craftsmanship. By 2010, Hickory's furniture employment had collapsed to 12,000. 70% of the industry had vanished in a single decade. The factories did not close because workers became lazy. Management did not suddenly forget how to run operations. Technology did not render the skills obsolete. A complete bedroom set from a Chinese factory arrived at American ports for less than the cost of raw lumber in North Carolina. The math made local production impossible. David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson constructed an econometric framework to measure this impact across the entire American economy. Their methodology divided the country into 722 commuting zones and calculated each zone's exposure to Chinese import competition based on its industrial composition. A commuting zone, dominated by pharmaceutical manufacturing, had low exposure. Chinese imports competed weakly in this sector during the study period. A commuting zone, dominated by textile or furniture production, had high exposure. Chinese imports devastated these industries. The researchers then tracked employment, earnings, and social outcomes across these zones from 1990 to 2011. The results confirmed the systematic nature of the damage. High-exposure commuting zones lost substantially more manufacturing jobs than low-exposure zones, even after controlling for automation, domestic demand shifts, and other factors. The job losses were not offset by gains in other sectors. Displaced manufacturing workers did not smoothly transition to service employment or other industries. They experienced prolonged unemployment, reduced lifetime earnings, and increased reliance on disability insurance and other transfer programs. The numbers were stark. 2.4 million jobs eliminated, concentrated in communities least equipped to absorb the shock. Spread across age groups least able to retrain and relocate. Follow-up research extended the analysis. A 2020 paper by the same research team documented political consequences. Counties with higher Chinese import exposure showed larger shifts in voting patterns between 2000 and 2016. The economic dislocation translated into political expression. European researchers replicated the methodology. UK economists found similar patterns in British manufacturing regions. German studies documented concentrated losses in traditional industrial centers. Spanish and Australian analyses confirmed the global scope of the China shock. The research demonstrated the structural nature of the displacement. This was not normal competitive pressure. Normal competition produces winners and losers, but allows adjustment over time. The China price compressed decades of industrial evolution into a few years. The speed overwhelmed adaptive capacity. A furniture factory closing over 2 decades allows workers to retire naturally, young people to choose different careers, and communities to develop alternative economic bases. A furniture factory closing in 3 years creates a mass layoff event. Workers in their 40s and 50s face impossible retraining challenges. Communities built around the industry lose their tax base before they develop alternatives. The academic literature documented another pattern: regional persistence. A decade after the peak import surge, high-exposure communities had not recovered. The job losses proved permanent. The earnings gaps persisted. The social indicators remained depressed. Economists had predicted mobility would solve the problem. Workers would move from depressed regions to growing areas. The labor market would rebalance. This prediction failed empirically. Mobility rates declined during the China shock period. Workers remained in damaged communities, trapped by underwater mortgages, family obligations, and the simple human attachment to place. The price advantage you received on furniture, clothing, and electronics was paid by specific communities: Hickory, Danville, Youngstown, Galesburg. The benefits dispersed to 330 million consumers. The cost concentrated in several thousand zip codes. The environmental cost sits in no invoice. No tariff schedule captures it. No WTO complaint addresses it directly. Yet this invisible subsidy rivaled currency manipulation and state support in its competitive impact. Manufacturing produces pollution. Every industrial economy in history has faced this reality. The question is whether pollution costs are internalized into product prices or externalized onto citizens and ecosystems. Developed economies spent decades constructing environmental regulatory frameworks: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, European environmental directives. These regulations imposed costs on manufacturers: scrubbers on smokestacks, treatment systems for wastewater, proper disposal of hazardous waste, monitoring and compliance reporting. An American steel mill operates under thousands of pages of environmental regulations. Each regulation adds cost. The costs appear in the final steel price. During the critical 2000 to 2015 period, Chinese manufacturing operated under dramatically different constraints. Regulations existed on paper. Enforcement remained sporadic. Local officials faced promotion criteria emphasizing economic growth and export performance. Environmental protection ranked low in the incentive structure. The World Bank attempted to quantify the cost. Their 2007 report, Cost of Pollution in China, estimated environmental damage at approximately 5.8% of GDP annually. Updated analyses through 2015 suggested the figure remained in the range of $100 to $250 billion per year. This damage represented a subsidy. Chinese factories dumped pollutants that would have required expensive treatment in regulated economies. The cost savings appeared in product prices. The cost itself appeared in Chinese cancer rates, in contaminated aquifers, in unbreathable air. Chinese Ministry of Ecology data told the story. By 2014, 70% of groundwater in industrial regions was classified as unfit for human contact. 16 of the world's 20 most polluted cities were in China. Respiratory disease rates in industrial zones exceeded national averages by multiples. An American furniture manufacturer paid for proper disposal of wood finishing chemicals. A Chinese competitor discharged similar chemicals into local waterways. The American product cost more. The Chinese product carried a hidden cost paid by Chinese villagers downstream. This environmental arbitrage was not sustainable. Chinese officials recognized the political danger as air quality in Beijing became an international embarrassment and domestic health concerns mounted. The regulatory environment began tightening after 2015. Enforcement improved. Factory closures for environmental violations increased, but the competitive advantage had already done its work. By the time environmental costs began normalizing, global manufacturing capacity had already migrated. The factories were already built. The supply chains were already established. The American and European competitors were already bankrupt. The environmental subsidy functioned as a one-time transfer. Pollute heavily during the growth phase. Capture global market share. Then begin cleanup after dominance is achieved. The strategy worked. Chinese manufacturing now accounts for approximately 30% of global output. The environmental costs are being slowly addressed through domestic policy, but the market share captured during the high pollution period remains. American and European manufacturers who maintained environmental compliance throughout the period cannot recover the lost decades. They cannot now compete against established Chinese suppliers with massive scale advantages, even as Chinese environmental costs normalize. The pattern continues. The products change. The strategy persists. In 2024, a BYD Seagull electric vehicle sells in China for approximately $10,000. A comparable American EV starts at $30,000. A comparable European model exceeds $40,000. The price gap is not 20%. It is 200 to 300%. Industry analysts dissect the components. Chinese battery costs have fallen faster than Western projections anticipated. Chinese labor costs remain lower. Chinese factories achieve higher capacity utilization. All of these factors contribute, but the analysts also identify familiar mechanisms. State subsidies to battery manufacturers totaling billions of dollars over the past decade. Government procurement policies favoring domestic EVs. Research and development costs shared between state research institutes and private companies. Land and electricity provided at below market rates to EV factories. The European Commission launched an investigation in October 2023. By October 2024, they announced tariffs of up to 45% on Chinese electric vehicles. The investigation documented subsidies across the value chain, from mining through battery production through final assembly. The Biden administration moved further. In August 2024, tariffs on Chinese EVs increased to 100%. Chinese batteries faced tariffs of 25%. Chinese solar cells faced tariffs of 50%. These tariffs represent the delayed recognition phase of the documented pattern. First, low-priced imports arrive. Consumers celebrate. Domestic producers warn of unfair competition. Policymakers hesitate, reluctant to raise consumer prices. Market share shifts. Domestic production contracts. The warnings become impossible to ignore. Tariffs arrive after the damage is largely complete. The solar industry already experienced this cycle. Chinese panel manufacturers received billions in state support during the 2005-2012 period. Prices dropped below production costs for any unsubsidized manufacturer. American solar companies, including Solyndra and dozens of others, filed for bankruptcy. German manufacturers who had pioneered solar technology shut down production. By the time tariff actions materialized, Chinese manufacturers controlled over 80% of global solar panel production. The tariffs made Chinese panels more expensive. They did not recreate domestic manufacturing capacity that had already been eliminated. The EV situation carries higher stakes. Automobiles represent a larger share of manufacturing employment than solar panels. The supply chain for EVs intersects with battery technology, critical minerals, and semiconductor production. Dependency in this sector creates vulnerability across multiple strategic industries. Chinese dominance in battery production already approaches solar panel levels. CATL and BYD together manufacture over 50% of global EV batteries. The mineral processing for battery materials runs through Chinese facilities at even higher percentages. Graphite processing, 90% China. Cobalt refining, 70% China. Lithium processing, 60% China. A trade conflict or geopolitical crisis would expose these dependencies immediately. American and European automakers attempting to source batteries from non-Chinese suppliers would find limited capacity and higher prices. The China price would become the only price for critical components. Policy responses now cluster under labels including decoupling, de-risking, and friendshoring. The terminology shifts. The underlying challenge remains consistent. 4 decades of price-driven manufacturing migration created dependencies not easily reversed. Building a battery factory requires 3 to 5 years from groundbreaking to production. Developing mineral processing capacity requires similar timeframes, plus the complication of permitting processes in regulated economies. Training the workforce adds additional years. The timelines for unwinding dependency exceed election cycles and budget cycles. The China price strategy exploited this asymmetry from the beginning. Construction is slow, destruction is fast. Building an industrial base requires decades of investment. Losing one requires a single decade of price competition. The evidence base leaves little room for alternative interpretation. The Congressional Research Service documented currency manipulation in 47 reports. The WTO dispute records catalog subsidies exceeding $500 billion. The The academic literature quantifies 2.4 million eliminated jobs. The environmental data reveals hundreds of billions in externalized costs. This was not free market competition producing efficient outcomes. This was strategic industrial policy designed to capture manufacturing capacity, regardless of true comparative advantage. The strategy succeeded on its own terms. China now produces 30% of global manufacturing output. Entire industries exist only in China. The supply chains for products, ranging from antibiotics to electronics to holiday decorations, run through Chinese facilities with no near-term alternatives. The costs appeared in American manufacturing employment, in European industrial decline, in Chinese environmental degradation. The benefits appeared in consumer prices and corporate profit margins. The distribution was unequal by design. You experience the results daily. The low prices at retail stores reflect the four mechanisms operating in combination over 4 decades. The pharmaceutical supply vulnerability exposed during COVID reflects the same concentration. The EV purchase decision you face next year reflects the continuation of the strategy into new industries. The $12 drill was never a free market miracle. It was the visible output of an invisible system. Currency manipulation provided a 15 to 40% price advantage. State subsidies added additional percentage points. Environmental externalization removed costs that American manufacturers paid. Labor cost suppression through controlled migration and limited union rights kept wages below market clearing levels. Stacked together, these mechanisms created a pricing floor unreachable by any manufacturer operating under normal market constraints. The China price was not a price at all. It was a policy outcome disguised as a market outcome. The present calculation. The 2024 tariff escalation represents a turning point or another delay. The pattern of previous decades suggests caution about declarations of fundamental change. Tariffs address the import price directly. They do not rebuild domestic capacity. They do not recreate supply chains. They do not train workers in skills the economy stopped requiring 15 years ago. The manufacturing employment lost during the China shock has not returned despite numerous policy initiatives. The communities damaged during that period have not recovered despite billions in economic development funding. The industrial knowledge embedded in closed factories has dissipated as workers aged out of the labor force. Tariffs on Chinese EVs make Chinese EVs more expensive. They do not make American EVs cheaper. They do not make American EV production more viable. The battery supply chain still runs through China. The mineral processing still concentrates in Chinese facilities. The cost structure still favors Chinese production. The tariff provides breathing room, nothing more. Using that breathing room to rebuild domestic capacity requires sustained investment exceeding anything currently appropriated. It requires permitting reform, allowing factories and mines to be built on timelines competitive with Chinese construction speeds. It requires workforce development programs aligned with actual industrial needs. It requires coordination between government policy and private capital at a scale American political economy rarely achieves. The Chinese system demonstrated the power of strategic patience, 40 years of consistent industrial policy, 5-year plans building on previous 5-year plans, subsidy programs evolving to address WTO rulings while maintaining effective support, currency management adjusting to circumstances while preserving competitive advantage. American policy demonstrated the opposite. Administrations changed, priorities shifted, programs launched and defunded, strategic attention wandered. The China price exploited this asymmetry. Long-term planning defeated short-term reactions. By the time each response materialized, the competitive landscape had already shifted. The question forward. Your next purchase decision arrives in a context shaped by 4 decades of documented strategy. The EV you consider carries a price reflecting Chinese industrial policy. The solar panels on your neighbor's roof reflect the same. The pharmaceutical supply chain your health depends upon reflects Chinese manufacturing concentration. These realities flow from documented history. Congressional reports, to WTO rulings, academic research, Chinese government planning documents. The evidence sits in accessible archives for anyone willing to examine it. The China price appeared in economic textbooks as a competitiveness benchmark. It should have appeared as a case study in strategic industrial policy successfully executed over generational timeframes. Understanding the construction of this system matters for evaluating proposed responses. Tariffs alone address symptoms. The underlying structure of concentrated production, dependent supply chains, and eliminated domestic capacity requires different tools. The next decade will determine whether the breathing room provided by tariff policy translates into structural rebalancing or merely delays further dependency. The history documented here provides the framework for evaluating that question. You now understand why the $12 drill costs $12. You understand the jobs it displaced, the environmental damage it caused, the strategic vulnerability it created. The price tag never captured these costs, but you paid them anyway. You continue paying them, and the question of whether future generations will pay higher costs still depends on decisions being made in this moment. shaped by the history traced through government archives, academic research, and WTO dispute records. The evidence is documented, the mechanisms are identified, the consequences are quantified. What remains is the response.